Hey everybody, welcome back to Something to Complain About. This is A. I'm here with T. T, it's good to see you this weekend. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, A. How are you?
I am good. I'm good. You were telling me earlier about having too much togetherness with oneself, and I'm approaching that point. So it's good to, be here, I guess.
There we go.
Was it an exciting
Yeah.
week? Did you do anything fun? Or did you just try to maintain
Uh,
and survive?
just tried to maintain and survive. Really
Totally
isn't.
understand. Anyway, what else is new, T, before we get into the fun of our
um,
actual conversation?
not not a whole lot, but I will say that this topic, I've been thinking about it a lot. And last night I could not sleep. And
Mhm.
so I read a book that kind of ties into, I think, what our topic is going to be today. And it's a book about a married couple, very happy with their lives. They've been married for a long time. They have a house, two successful careers, and they feel kind of peer pressured into having a baby.
Oh,
And the wife has a very rough pregnancy, a nightmare pregnancy, and they start having all these like weird things happen around the house and stuff. And it turns out it's kind of like a little demon baby that
oh,
they have. Yeah. So, which, that doesn't really bother me anymore because I no longer have a uterus. So, all kinds of
yeah.
stuff would have to magically align for that to happen to me now. But so I just kind of read it as a ha, I dodged a bullet, dodged a bullet.
You'd
Um,
have to be somewhere on the biblical track for that.
but it was kind of a bit of a like a Rosemary's Baby, The Omen
Yeah,
kind of vibe. The Fifth Child by, was it Doris Lessing or Dolores Lessing? Um, so like, along the list of some of these nightmare books they tell you not to read when you're trying to conceive or when you
yeah.
are pregnant, or like we need to talk about Kevin. Those, yeah. So I just laid there in bed last night, just kind of laughing and chuckling because, as you know, don't have any children, no longer
Hmm.
have a uterus. And yeah, so to me, it was good entertainment. But I have read books in the past where I was trying to conceive, where it's like, or watch a movie and kind of go, maybe it's a good thing we're having a hard time with this because with our luck, this is what would happen.
This is, it does kind of tie very neatly into what we were hoping to discuss today. So that is
Yeah,
maybe somewhat serendipitous that you needed to read a book to help yourself sleep last night.
maybe,
Maybe.
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I I think where it really ties in is just kind of this, and this is one thing I've been thinking about too, how we are often pressured in a way by our peers or our family members that we end up making decisions that maybe we weren't doing wholeheartedly,
Yes. I think
or
that's true.
just um or like my family will say, fine, I'll do it if it'll shut you up. um
Hmm.
and that was another kind of key theme of this book that I read, was that neither half of the couple were really way into, yes, let's do this, let's have a kid. This is what I really, really want. And so their ambivalence about everything kind of plays into how the novel plays out.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really, not the demon child bit, um, but you and I both worked in social work, and we've encountered enough demon children on our own that we do know they exist. Um,
They sure do.
but I think I'm related to a couple. But I'm pretty sure I was one. But I was
Fair.
just thinking about the ambivalence that the couple in this book have, and um, that it ties into, I think, maybe some of the things that we are seeing manifesting in the topic that we're talking about today. And do you want to
That's fair.
share what we're talking about?
Yeah, I suppose we should clue in our listeners. They're probably listening, going, "What the hell is happening here?" So we ran across some articles that really kind of um, they're thematic with some of the things that we have talked about before, right? With other generations and things that they're doing differently than maybe our generation, the generation before us. And this one is specific to
Mhm.
the lack of grandkids for boomers and boomers being angry about that or being depressed or sad or frustrated or whatever words you want to use about it. And literally bitching to whoever will listen about the fact that they do not have grandkids or they don't have enough grandkids. Um, and that it's hard to read those kinds of articles and know how to respond exactly. Like initially you feel bad because you think, "Oh yeah, you should have grandkids." And then you step back and you think, "But wait a minute, we'd be the ones that would have to give you them." Right?
Right.
And we've talked, I think, in other episodes very specifically about the challenges everybody post boomer has faced, right? So Gen
Hmm.
Xers as our our generation is facing sort of now the sandwich generation reality where gosh, I mean, when we were growing up, there were some very specific expectations, right? The expectations were
Hmm.
you go to college so that you can get a job, you get married and have a family, right? You're gonna have kids. Like it wasn't so much like you can go do whatever you want. It's more like these are society's expectations and they're being communicated to you not just by the people around you, but by the people raising you and the people who raised
Hmm.
them, right? Like,
Right.
someday I can still hear my uncle, God love him, talking about how, you'll find a nice chick someday and you'll have a bunch of kids and then, you'll be dealing with all this stuff. And I'm like going, little do you know, but
Yeah. Joke's on you.
right, that's not happening. I mean, like
Well,
it's hard
I
to know.
as I said, and I thought about this with the whole grandchildren thing. And in one of the articles that I read, as we all know, a lot of Gen Xers now are becoming grandparents.
Yes.
And that same message is coming from Gen Xers. And so like you mentioned, there's a lot of stuff, and we've covered a lot of this, the economy and education and climate and all those huge things
Yeah.
that now are very much generational issues. But I was thinking this morning, and as you know, we worked really hard to have a family, and it did not work out for us.
Hmm.
And we tried for years and years and years and years. Um, but there's, so I was thinking about this. I thought, who was I getting all of this gruff from when I would go to uh, family gatherings or meet with friends? And T, when are you going to get pregnant? T, when are you going to have a baby? T, have you tried this? T, have you tried that?
Yeah.
Um, and it was all from boomers
Hmm.
and Gen Xers.
Yep. Yep.
So I can see a pattern of behavior
Hmm.
from even what I was going through starting, almost 25 years ago, when my husband and I were like, okay, well, let's go ahead and start, you know, trying to have a family, and all of the bullshit that we put up with, and a lot of the direct comments and insinuations and things, even from like even beyond the expectation, But the fact that we were having issues, that it was my fault, I wasn't good enough, I wasn't woman enough, God decides to punish me, and all this stuff, which is not true, but
Hmm.
it still hurts,
Of course.
especially then when you see. Um, when I worked in fields where I worked with a lot of people who were products of very shitty parenting.
Right.
It's like, yeah, I don't think God works that way. But as I was thinking about all of this and thinking of all the stuff that I put up with and the stuff that even my mom had to listen to.
Right.
And one time my mom, I was not even present, but one time my mom, and she was at like this extended family gathering where even her cousins were like, when is T going to have a baby? And my mom was finally like, T's not ever going to be able to conceive without significant medical intervention.
Right.
And that kind of shut everybody up. Was that anybody's business? No.
Nope. Nope.
And yet nobody offered to pony up any money for any fertility treatments.
Right. Which are
Oh,
extremely expensive.
extremely expensive. So, as I've been thinking about this, I'm wondering how much of people are now saying, like, first of all, it's very expensive to adopt. You have to go through so many hoops that people do not meet, or they're afraid they they won't meet. And a lot of the problems with like the adoption process is that you can go so far in and then it's like, oh yeah, but you don't meet this. Well, what about all this time and money that we spent? It doesn't matter. Um, and and of course, then any kind of fertility treatments, and then even having a child is expensive when if everything stars align um, and that. But I'm wondering how much of this is now people are not communicating the fertility issues and stuff that they have that maybe we had talked about more in the past, where it's
Yeah,
just
that I
like,
hadn't really thought about before. But that, yeah. Well, I think people have become less willing to let others into their private lives, right? Like we have everybody's
right.
doing everything on TikTok and Instagram and whatever, Twitter, X, social media, whatever you think of, right? Everybody's doing all that stuff in all different ways, but I think the vast majority of people are still sort of like, I just don't want to talk about this particular part of my life with everybody, and I think that's
Well,
perfectly fair. You shouldn't have
and
to.
and I think the issue is that like my husband and I, we told very few people,
Hmm.
but people are nosy and people also figure stuff out,
Yeah,
because you can only say like, oh, we're trying for so long before people start putting things
realizing,
like they've been trying for 5 years. So either they're lying or there's some issues.
right.
Um, but I'm wondering
Well,
how, if there's some elements of that. Because I tell you what, over time, it was just easier for us. And I will say over time, because we had a lot of time to think through things and think through a lot of things, including like family health history and mental health history and things that if given enough time, you do talk yourself out of it. Or you kind of do that. We're going to do one final shot. And if that's not going to work, then we're done. And people don't have to, they don't need to talk about those things. And I think, I mean, it still is kind of pretty painful for me because there was a lot of situations that I was put into where I would have to defend myself or defend things for something that is like, I don't know, does anybody have to defend getting cancer or being born with a cleft palate
right.
or being born with blue eyes, you know. Um, so I'm wondering if some of that is going on and it's just being masked with, we're not ready or we're not interested or it's not fitting into our lives right now as more of an instant shutdown instead of putting up with some of the bullshit that I put up with and other women who are about my age who had the same issues we all had to listen to. Um, because you already know you're working at a deficit when you can't conceive. You don't need somebody telling you that God's punishing you for your sins or
Right.
you're not woman enough or, you don't
Yeah.
need that on top of everything else when your body's not doing what it's supposed to.
Well, and I wonder if for some people the reverse is also maybe true, where instead of just being honest about the fact that they didn't want kids,
Mhm.
they would scapegoat infertility, even if they weren't actually having an infertility issue. I wonder if some people would also use infertility as a reason to maybe get people off their back.
Yeah. And I think it could work either way.
Yeah.
Um, but it all can be filed under none your
It should all be
business.
filed under Nunya, and I think there shouldn't be any real concern, right? Like, if you want to
No.
have kids if you can, and if you don't want to have kids, it really shouldn't be a mark of societal
Right.
acceptance or whatever. Like,
And
you're somehow better because you have kids. I mean, kids
but
are difficult, they're expensive, they take a lot of time and energy, and a lot of people have kids who probably shouldn't.
well, and I think we're starting to see some changes with that
I think we are.
because
Yeah.
when I think about it now, and just even when you understand child development, human development across the lifespan, the adverse childhood effects, stress, instability, poverty, absent parents, and physically absent but also emotionally absent, um, growing up in houses with addictions, whatever that addiction may be, all this and that, and we're realizing how much that affects brain development and emotional development and physical development, has lifetime impacts. And I think people are starting to think a bit more now, and I'm glad they are. Like, parenthood is just like another job in the sense that if you want it done right, you're going to have to work really, really hard at it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a
It-
oopsie, here we go
yeah,
thing.
yeah, because now um, we know what needs to be done far better for children to thrive. Like
Hmm.
we sit on tons and tons and tons of empirical evidence, and for someone to sit there and go, yeah, this isn't for me, or maybe we are having issues, and but you know what, we're not going to pursue it because this is just work on top of work. I admire that so much more than I do some people who to this day are just popping out babies like they don't understand where they come from.
Well, I think that's like our parents' generation didn't have the benefit of a lot of that knowledge, right? Like, it was
No, no.
expected. Married kids, married kids, married kids. Like,
Well,
that's what was required
so
or what was
but
expected
I
of you.
but I think that might be part of the rub because now we have all this knowledge,
Hmm.
and the younger generations who are entering the years where they could become parents if they so choose are looking at all of the evidence and going, we really, yeah, this is like another investment, but it's an investment in another whole human being. Um, and you can screw them up in any number of ways a million times over. And one other thing too that I'm starting to see more that I never did see when I was trying to conceive. It's like the band-aid has been pulled off on even what pregnancy does to a body.
Yes. Yep.
And I think it's one of those things where even amongst the women, there are things we don't talk about. And I've talked about, how like I wish somebody would have told me about menopause and perimenopause. That would have been awesome. Um, and
Yep.
now I won't ever stop shutting up about it because,
Because you want people to be aware.
because I want people to be aware. Like this is,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but the same is too, like, I mean, you always see, from the outside in, and of course, you're not going to talk about stuff like, grade three episiotomies and polite company and, uh, just things,
No,
things like that.
you don't.
Um, but now with a lot of social media and stuff, like you see women and they're
Yeah.
showing, even showing their stomachs. Like how many women think they're gonna go leave the hospital after giving birth wearing the blue jeans that they wore 2 months before they conceived? Yeah,
Yep.
no, you're wearing your maternity clothes out, and
Yeah.
this is why.
And it could take a while, but like you may never get back to the size you were before. You might,
Right.
but you might not. I think when I was in grad school, when we were studying, pregnancy related complications, nutritionally or
Mhm.
whatever, one of the things that stunned me and still stuns me, and it was because like nobody would have talked to me about it before. There would have been no reason for me to kind of know about it before, but like the
Mhm.
number of women who lose their teeth
Yes.
because during pregnancy because the calcium is leached from their teeth
Yep.
for the baby, right? So the baby gets what the baby needs. The maternal body has to give, right? There's no block it. Like the baby, it's just that's the way it works. I remember when I saw the first patient I'd ever seen that had she had horrible. She had the pictures of her before she got pregnant. I mean, she had sort of perfect teeth that she'd had. You could tell she'd had braces, right? Like all the stuff we all grew up with. She's our age,
Mhm.
but she was at a point where she was going to need dentures because the damage to her teeth from her pregnancy was
Oh,
so severe that was where she was, and she was at the time when I met her, she was like early 30s, right? So this was a while ago, but like I was just completely shocked. And the number of times that I see people like that now, it's not an uncommon thing to have happen.
it's
It's far
it's
more
not
common that there are complications than not.
well, and because that's exactly what I was going to say. That you can lose teeth. And
Okay.
I was in my mid 30s before I even knew that. And it
Mhm.
was
Me
from a
too.
conversation with a supervisor of mine. And she's like, yes, I have two kids and I lost one tooth for each kid.
Yep.
So again, it's those things that you don't talk about. And even in because Lord knows I read all the baby books and all the blogs and everything else. I never encountered that reading. But so I think a lot of those conversations now are happening too, where it's because it is all just reality, right?
Right.
We always grew up looking at the Kodak moments and
Right.
talking about those,
Instead
and
of
that's what the evidence that
yeah.
we had. But now it's if you want to go through it, I mean, go nuts. But I think sometimes, like with a lot of other things, once you become fully informed or more fully informed, you're like, yeah, I'm gonna tap out. I'm good.
Well, I mean, it's sort of a sad state of affairs when you realize that fully informed consent, if you want to think of it as consent, because it is in many ways, right?
Right.
If you really think of the fully informed side of that, and that is dissuading people from wanting to go forward, right? We have gone through millennia now of not great information. But there was a
Right.
very long period of time until maybe 100 years ago where women were dying in childbirth frequently. We have some of
Well,
the craziest maternal mortality rates in the industrialized world in this country because of our healthcare
today,
system. Today
today,
in
yes.
2024, we have some of the, especially in some of the southern states, but in states in general, like our maternal child mortality rate is, it should not be what it is for a
Well,
nation that has as much resources as we do, as much education as we do, as many, like the doctor, like our healthcare system. There's a lot of reasons it is, but it shouldn't be.
there's in the book that I read, which is called The Vile Thing We Created, and I'll
Hmm.
put like the Amazon link to it. The main female character is a Black woman.
Hmm.
And that does tie into her prenatal experience and even the postnatal experience of her being a Black woman, even though she's married to a white man, but just how she's treated by the physicians and the psychiatrists. It's very, very real. Um, and there's now, the days, even within rural communities. Like I remember when I was growing up, or like when I was very young, all of the doctors who were just general practitioners would deliver babies. Like you just went to
Hmm.
your doctor, he delivered
Yep.
your baby. And then even in the time that I was still growing up, over time, it was like we went from all five doctors in the county delivering babies to two of the doctors will deliver your baby.
Yep.
And now we know that there are deserts. I was talking with a friend of mine who has a niece in western Nebraska. She is 120 miles away from the nearest obstetrician, the
I'm surprised.
nearest doctor who will deliver her baby.
Yep.
How rough of a car ride is that going to be, even when everything goes normal?
Yeah, that's very similar to like where I grew up. We had, right, the doctors in our small town hospitals where I grew up would deliver babies. I remember working in the hospital as a volunteer and they were delivering babies, right? That was just normal.
Mhm.
The
Yeah,
doctor who did most of our care when we were growing up delivered babies. His wife was also a doctor. She delivered babies. When I was in high school, that started to change. Suddenly, it was only one doctor in the hospital would deliver babies.
yeah.
And I remember asking why, because
Malpractice, right?
I was very like shocked. Suddenly, it was only just the one doctor out of the whole hospital would
Mhm.
deliver babies. And they said, I just remember them saying at the time that it was $30,000 a year. This was in 1994 or three or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know why I remember the number, but all these years later, I still remember him saying it cost us $30,000 a year per doctor to have the malpractice insurance to cover delivering babies. So the hospital can't afford to continue to pay. And if you have a
Mhm.
complication in a small town hospital like this, they really don't have a lot of other options other than to convert to an emergency C-section and put you on. I mean, if they can, they will. And if
Yeah.
they, can't, they're packaging
But,
you up and putting you in an ambulance and sending you to another hospital an hour or two away. So they just
um,
stopped.
well, and even with that, I mean, even when you look at how many it, individuals have issues in big city hospitals, like I had one aunt who gave birth in a huge city, and she hemorrhaged like 12 hours after giving birth,
Hmm.
and they almost lost her in a huge major hospital.
Yep.
So even so these stories I think are, and even looking at how insurance operates now. Like when my mom had me, and granted, I mean, she had complications with me, but I mean, she was in the hospital with me. We were in the hospital for a week afterwards.
Yep.
And my parents didn't even have insurance. As a matter of fact, I still have the little statement of where they paid me off or paid, paid off the hospital for me for like 10, like $10 a month or whatever. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's the cost, it's the insurance, and it's the knowledge because I know, like with my husband, it's like if he would see some of the stuff that like I've seen pop up the last 5 years with women talking about these things, he would first thing he would do would be look at me and go, "Why would you ever want to do this?" Like I
It's a
wouldn't
fair
I wouldn't
question.
ask you, right? And I wouldn't ask you to
Mhm.
do this.
And I think there's still a lot of that in the patriarchal reality that we still live in. I
Mm,
think men still are sort of maybe raised in some ways to think like that they're entitled to have a family, like they're entitled to find a wife and have kids with that wife. And that
mhm,
may play into part of some of the reality that people are right. So I think now we're also seeing a shift in some of these younger generations where they're looking all of that and going, do we really want to do this? Like, do we
mhm,
really want to take on all of that? Are we ready for that? Like, it's just it's a lot. I we It's interesting that you mentioned the statement, right? Like, my mom has the statement from when she was born in
mhm.
1952 from the hospital, like $9.59 for her their hospital stay or whatever. I still remember seeing it. She still has it. Um, but like we're at a point now today where you're in and out in a day, right? You're almost
Yeah,
always released the following day. You're sent home. Insurance companies don't want to pay for you to be there longer unless there are
yeah.
absolutely obvious complications. So I think that's also part of like the I think the younger generations look at that and think, like we've talked about this in relation also to like student loan debt and
Mhm.
right going to college and that kind of stuff. I think they look at the experiences our generations had and maybe even our parents and think,
Well,
do I want to spend that much
and,
money? Do I have
well,
that much money?
here's another thing that I just thought of. I remember when I was trying to get pregnant, and my mom had to work. I mean, she had to work for a living. A lot of people, and we've talked about this, a lot of older people are still employed. And so my mom would joke that, like, well, I'll just send grandma up to stay with you for a few weeks after
Yeah,
you have the baby. And I'm like,
yeah,
well, then grandma's going to be dead and T's in jail, and you're going to be raising the grandbaby. Um,
right.
but I mean, even the opportunity for that isn't always there anymore. Like when I was born, both my maternal grandparents were there when I was born. And then my grandmother stayed with us for almost 2 weeks afterwards.
Yeah,
So
that
my
was
mom
yeah,
could lay at home and recover. And that was after spending almost about a week in the hospital after giving birth to me. And then my grandmother still stayed another couple weeks. Those days are over.
yeah,
And I don't know how many times I hear or I've seen, like, okay, well, grandma comes by and helps in the evening after work, and the other grandma comes by in the morning before work.
yeah.
But the days of the grandmother, either grandmother, um, coming in and being able to, help take care of the house, or an older aunt come over and help, those those days are over. So that's, I think, another key piece. You are taking this baby who might be 24 hours old or 36 hours old, and you're going home and you don't have any support, or you
Well,
might have support for the weekend.
I think that's historically this is now the anomaly, right? I mean,
Yes.
even if you look
Mhm.
at antiquity, you look at everything from antiquity, anything that we have documentation of, right? Civilization wise, study wise, whatever,
Mhm.
families did stuff like that. Like, this is not new.
Mhm.
What's new is what we have now. So,
Yes.
up until now, families did that. When I was born, my paternal grandparents were 20 miles from where we lived. My maternal grandparents were almost 300. But
Mm,
my paternal grandparents, I was the first grandchild, right? So they were there at
mm,
the hospital. I was one of the last grandchildren on my mom's side, right? So that I wasn't, it wasn't as exciting when I showed up as it was for my dad's parents, but like they
mm,
were there. They didn't even, my mom just sort of remembers, like, I don't think they even cared how I felt. They really just wanted to take care of you, which was fine because that gave me time to rest and heal and do what I needed to do. But when my nephew was born, like my parents waited a very long time to have grandkids. Obviously, I don't have any kids. They were well into their 60s, as I recall. Yeah, like maybe 64, 65, probably, when my nephew was born. And my mother was like, she finished her teaching contract out for that year. They literally drove to where my brother lived, right? 220 miles away from
mm,
where my parents lived. They drove there twice a month for the weekend because that's how much my mom wanted to see the baby. So she spent as much time with them as they could. She moved down there so that she could help with
mm.
daycare when my sister-in-law went back to work. She did all that stuff. That was normal. And it was maybe by the
Well,
grace of God she could
it,
do that because they were roughly retirement age anyway. If it would have been 10 years earlier, she could not have. Mom and dad would
well,
have had to continue to work.
you bring up a great point because it isn't just going home and helping take care of the baby, but I don't know how many times growing up, like my grandparents would watch us or one of my cousins who
Yep.
are sick, so
Yep.
someone could work.
Mhm.
Um, but grandma was home all day.
Yep. That's not the case for
Uh,
our parents
yes,
and their grandkids.
that's not the case so much anymore. And so it's even just having that safety net because I know even like in Omaha, there are only like two places that will take a kid, like an emergency. That's not the term, but like a child care center that will take a sick child so the parent could go to work. There's
Oh,
only
okay.
like two in Omaha,
Hmm.
and they're always full.
I'm not surprised.
You know, so even having that safety net again of having a grandparent or an old auntie or even having the neighbor lady who you've known since you were a kid watch your kid, those days are over.
Hmm.
So when you start thinking about all of those things, yeah, I mean, it's easy to talk yourself out of a lot of stuff. And I think too, I wonder too with some of this, because the baby boomers are getting up there in age.
Yeah.
So some of these, and I think they were talking primarily about millennials, um, but I don't know. Like if I had a parent who was 70 and I was still childbearing age, and I was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to have a kid, I'd be looking very closely at my parents' health.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's where
Yeah.
we have this conversation, right, about the sandwich generation that we've I think probably
Right.
touched on before. I don't Our parents didn't have to think about necessarily as much the caring for their parents while they were caring for their own kids because their generation got married generally fairly young, right?
Younger.
Very early
Yeah.
20s, sometimes late teens, early 20s typically, and started salad shootering out babies. Boom, 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 done, right? Like my grandmother
Mhm.
had 6 and 5 years. It was just a thing. So you've got this situation where by the time those kids are out of the house, then maybe 15 years later, their parents started
Right.
entering the phase where they might need some help and they had ways to help. Our
Yeah.
generation is now in the position, and even some millennials, I think, are probably also in the position where their parents are on the brink, if not already at a point where they're going to need help. And
Mhm.
they still have kids at home. So now you've got a three generations under one roof potential situation. And
Mhm.
who's making all the money to do it? Because the boomers at this
Right.
point, if they have to live with you, probably aren't making any money. And we like, so I think there's a whole lot of that, and which I think is really interesting
Yeah.
about some of these articles is that I think millennials still struggle with the concept specifically of I have a duty to have kids, and here's all this other crap that I have to deal with. And then you see this
Mhm.
transition kind of in the literature a bit where you have Gen Zers who are almost free of that expectation, right? Like they no longer primarily feel like they have to meet that expectation because they're looking at it going, no effing way. I can't afford a house.
Mhm.
I can't even move out of my own parents' house. Why I can't find a
Mhm.
girlfriend or a boyfriend. Like they can't afford to survive in a lot of ways. And they're looking at college and all these other things and they're thinking, why
Well,
would I even
and
want to?
these safety nets that even though, I grew up in poverty, we still had the social safety net of like my grandparents,
Yeah,
my aunts and uncles. So I can see now where it's sort of like, well, who, if I'm helping my my parents or my parents aren't in a place to help me, then who's going to help me when I need help?
right.
And and I think too, I'm wondering how much of this is again kind of going back to some of these entitlement issues that we see, because like one of the messages is like, you owe us grandchildren. Nobody owes you shit in life.
Correct. Correct.
um
But like
one
they
thing
felt that onus on themselves, right? I mean, and some of
well
this is also
they
sociological in the sense that their parents would be our great grand or like our grandparents didn't also have access to contraception in the same way that our parents
but
did.
here's the thing, there is also such a thing called read the room, and then there's also another thing called it's not all about you. And so
Right, but
if
you're talking about the wrong generation to apply that to, like I know that's what we would like to apply, but they don't function in that reality. And part of I think the reason they don't is because when they got married, like just think about the sociological perspective here of just generally thinking about premarital sex and the sort of stigma around it. And if you got pregnant in the 1940s, it was scandal, scandal, scandal. Even if you got pregnant probably outside of marriage in the 1970s, it was still kind of scandal. Now people get pregnant outside of marriage all the time and nobody really thinks anything of it. But you've got this entire situation where you've got your boomer folks who were in a lot of ways they were getting married because they wanted to be able to have sex legitimately, right? Like there's
oh my gosh, you are underestimating the number of shotgun weddings.
oh no, I'm sure they're right, but like that was just to get around
There,
the shame, right? The stigma. It was like,
right.
if you did the
I
shotgun
mean,
wedding right,
I
people
think
didn't know
it's
it was a shotgun wedding.
well, anybody could do math, but as my mother always said, the first baby never takes 9 months.
She's well, I mean,
Yeah.
but yes, that's probably true. But like you could legitimately make the case that the baby came early or that you got pregnant on your wedding night. Like that's why they did them, right? Like it was a total Hail
You,
Mary,
I gave
but
you
still.
the excuse. I gave you the excuse. The first baby never takes 9 months.
Oh,
And
that was their excuse. I just thought she was doing the
and
math.
yeah. And but then again too, like, I mean, it was one of those things like, okay, everybody kind of knew or suspected, but nobody talked about, because how many 9-pound babies were parents trying to pass off as preemies? Like, because
Oh,
I
a
remember my
lot.
grandmother, talking about, like, that 8-pound baby that was 22 inches long was not a preemie.
Well, yes.
Like, or like, if that one was a preemie, it's a good thing she didn't carry him to full term.
This is an awful story, but this is the story of how my grandparents got married. She was 16, he was 28. They wanted to get married and they were not able to get the consent of her parents to get married because at that time you still needed the consent of her parents to get
Yeah.
married.
Yeah.
So they lied and told my great grandparents that they were
Hmm.
pregnant.
Oh no, were these your dad's parents?
Yeah.
And it backfired on him.
It
Oh
backfired on them
no,
because they were unable to get pregnant for a very long time after that.
long time. Yeah.
In fact, they had
Oh,
tried for so many years, they adopted my dad and a month later got pregnant with my uncle. Somehow
but you know
adopting my
that.
dad was the trigger. I don't understand.
But
Like, it seems to happen, but like they
no,
adopted my
it
dad and
does.
then it was five babies in 6 years, just immediately following the adoption of my dad.
You know, it does happen. One family that I grew up with, and it actually was kind of cute because both of the boys were born like within like 6 months of each other or something. Um, and they they were like, and it was a case of that they were in the adoption process and they knew they were going to get the baby, and apparently somebody relaxed or something because they got so. But it was so cute because these two little boys, they'd be like, one of us is adopted, but we forget who.
That's
And the thing
fair.
is like, it's like people didn't remember either because they were so close in age. And,
It's fair. I mean,
you know,
like
and after a while,
they were married for 8 years at that point. So they
well,
went 8 years married, no kids, didn't think they were ever going to have kids, wanted to adopt kids. Very Catholic family, right? So they were going to have kids.
mm,
And then they would have probably had more, but she had such significant complications with the last two that after she had the last one, the doctor was like, you can't have any more. You have to stop, which is also what happened to two of
mm,
my aunts, right? They had so many
yeah.
kids in such a short period
Well,
of time
that's
that they
that's
couldn't
why
anymore.
that's why a lot of hysterectomies were common back then.
Yeah,
They were therapeutic.
they were. And they were also
Um,
prophylactic.
yeah,
They were
but
completely prophylactic.
um, but with this, I'm thinking though, yeah, and it's just, and I was listening to a video earlier today where I was talking about, it's taking longer, and it has been for people to kind of hit those like quote unquote adult
Milestones.
milestones,
Yeah,
and it also made me think about how many people have dogs. And so what, well, no, because think about this. Because before we did our last kind of hurrah, I was like, either this works or I get a dog.
I
And it
remember.
didn't work.
And you got two
And I
dogs.
got and I got my dog. I got my
Hmm.
first dog. And it took me 5 weeks to potty train him. And he wouldn't eat food and he didn't know what walking was and he didn't know how to play. And it almost killed me. And he knew no commands or any, and I'm like, I remember one time I was just like, I was a mess and my nails were a mess, my hair was a mess, everything. And my husband's like, it would be 10 times worse if we had a kid. And I'm like, I can't even handle a damn chihuahua.
Well,
Yeah.
in all
Like,
fairness, Chihuahuas are the hardest of all the dogs to handle. So
but I
understandable,
think
but
though,
yes,
like you
correct.
have those moments of clarity where it's sort of like, I have what to do to potty train this dog. I don't think I could have handled potty training a human being.
Well, I wonder if it also does it lead you to the point where you start to deconstruct, like, why did I want it so bad? What led me to
You
think
do.
I
Well,
needed to do it?
and we actually, and I know for myself, I cycled through that quite a bit,
Yeah,
especially in my mid to late 30s. And it was, is it what are the drivers here? Um, and really when I sat down and really thought about it, it was the idea
yeah,
and it was the ideal. Like how I envisioned it was
right.
how I what was ideal for me and how I thought things would go. So again, I talked about like those Kodak moments earlier. That's sort of what it is, right? You don't
Yeah,
think about when I didn't think about like sleepless nights or losing teeth or um I think one of the big things was when a lot of the mental health issues on my side came to light in my family, and seeing traits from generation to generation. And so that was one of the things, like when I really sat down, especially being in my late 30s, and being told, well, like if you get pregnant, it's a geriatric pregnancy, which for whatever reason, I think of old women like in a Jurassic Park setting,
Yeah.
and like they're pregnant, and I don't know why. But when I started doing the math of, okay, if I have a sibling who has schizophrenia, what are the odds of one of my children having schizophrenia? And it was something like 25%. And then you start having some of these hard conversations with yourself, like, I already have responsibility for one schizophrenic in my life.
Yeah.
What if I have two? Or with the other disabilities my sister has? I already have this in my life. What if I have a child with disabilities?
Yeah.
Like, what is my bandwidth? And then two, and this is something people do not want to talk about, but it is how much of this is fulfilling a need or a want that I have. How much is it justifying something for myself, um, versus the whole responsibility of, here's another whole human being that they're going to be talking about me in therapy for most of their adulthood. Um, how do I avoid that? Um,
Yeah.
and it's not, and it has to go beyond the good intentions of, well, I want to do better than my parents did. Well, yeah, I mean, we all do, right? Duh. I mean, that's part of the goal of humanity is we try to do better than the last generation. But when I really would sit and think about how selfish it really is at the end of the day, then it was hard to kind of talk myself out of it. And it's like, my genetics are not that special that we need to continue. We need to carry this on.
That's fair. I think that's also probably why Gen Z looks at a lot of this and starts to look at their own, right? They're
Yeah.
suffering in some ways from a lot more. I think they have got a lot more diagnosed mental health issues. I don't think that means they have more. I
No, I think
I
we're
think it's
just better at diagnosing.
I
Mm.
think yeah, I think it's a reality that we're catching it. But I think they're looking at all of it and just thinking, you really, really, really need to want it. And you really need to be ready for it. Instead of our generations who jumped into it, right? Because even when we
Mhm.
were young, I realized there were lots of shotgun weddings, but even when we were young, we were still supposed to like go to college, get a degree, find a husband or a wife, and then start having a family. Like, how many weddings did we go to? Not just together, but just, weddings that we were either at or a part of in undergrad or shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
And I know the church that we were in the last few years that I was in high school, a lot of those kids were getting married in the first before they could even buy alcohol.
Yeah.
And part of that
Yeah.
was because they were being driven so hard with this message, like, you cannot have sex outside of marriage. And then suddenly they were having babies, and they are still sort of babies themselves, right? Like they've not even been able to buy beer. They can't. Not that they were going to buy beer,
There's,
but you know, Gen Z looks
I,
at this and goes, "These people were nuts." Like they didn't, and they
well,
may look at their own parents and think, we all do this a little bit. Like we all judge our parents a little bit. Like what's the poem you used to recite to me?
oh, this be the verse. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think though, when I think even the narrative, though, like with individuals who are younger now, like say like in their teens and in their 20s, there are so many role models now who either, for whatever reason, they didn't have children.
Mhm.
Whereas like when I was growing up, and obviously, as I spoke about earlier, there was always the assumption that if a woman didn't have children, there was something wrong with her.
Yeah.
Like my mom had a cousin, he and his wife never had children. I don't know why.
Hmm.
But I remember one time I was like 10 or 12, and I was like, why don't so and so and so and so have children? And my grandmother goes, well, because the wife never wanted to grow up.
Right. The judgment is there.
Yeah, the judgment is there. But I think for a lot of younger people, they are getting enough exposure to people who don't have children that they're realizing, okay, that this doesn't have to be the narrative. And if I don't think it's for me, or if I don't think it's for me right now, it doesn't have to be. But on the flip side, there is still that conversation because I was listening to a video earlier this week where one woman who was very young, she's Gen Z, so she was in her early 20s, said, well, I had a baby because all the mothers are around me are held at such high status, and that was the status that I wanted.
Yep.
And that ranks right up there with, well, I was horny, and we all get horny. That's not an excuse either. We all want to get laid.
Right. But that
So,
isn't synonymous with we all want to have babies.
right.
You know what I
Right.
mean?
So, so like the horniness, like we all get horny. So, like, just admit you're not responsible. Like in this day and age, like I got a neighbor who is 30 at the most, 6 kids in 7 years, and it's like, the days of oopsie baby after oopsie baby after oopsie baby are long over.
Yeah.
Like, I give everyone a free divorce and everyone one free oopsie surprise baby. After that, you
It's
you need
intentional.
to you, you're either doing something you shouldn't be or you're not doing something you should
Yeah.
in this day and age. Oh, um, and then she laughed about it. I have too many kids. Yeah, you do, and you're not raising them.
That's usually the case. But I think
So,
that's also like some of these generations look around and see that, and they see the
right,
multiple kids and the constant stress, and they think like I can't do that. And
right.
nobody should have to. And I think they also feel
Well,
more comfortable just saying this isn't good for me. I'm not going to do it.
I was doing some just kind of cataloging in my mind of all the people I know, my age and younger. So, about we'll say we'll say 50. We'll kind of ramp it up a little bit, and younger. And the all the people who I know, and like the ones who have kids, how many kids do they have?
Hmm.
And even among, so I'm talking Gen X, millennials. I don't know any Gen Zers yet who have babies. Um, one, two, or three. I do not personally know anyone or am related to anyone who has more than 3 kids. And the ones who, and all of the kids, and maybe I just know responsible people, but like each child was on purpose.
Yeah.
There are no oopsie babies
Right.
in my friend and family group. I have a few friends who are like, we said we were going to have one. We have one. We're done.
Hmm.
I do have one friend they wanted 4 and it didn't work out. She had very hard pregnancies and um, they they decided not. And then they were like, well, we could always, adopt later or foster. And then the third one, they brought him home and it was like bringing home 5 babies at once. And he's like 10 now. And now he's like 5, 10 year olds at once. And they're like, there's a reason. There's a reason.
There's a reason we stopped.
Well, it's kind of like with me and my dogs, right? Like we had Charlie for 6 years, and we're like, oh, things are going so well and so smooth, and we got a system now. So let's bring in another dog, and then we bring home Mia, and it was like bringing home 8 dogs at once.
It still is.
It still is. And sometimes my husband and I will be like, we'll look at you and we're like, this is how people end up with the second child, isn't it? Because like you get the first one figured out, just like we got the
Yep.
first dog figured out, and then you don't always stop to think it's a it's a gamble with each new addition, right?
Absolutely. And maybe that's also just Gen Z these days is like, we're not gambling. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, for some of these younger individuals, I mean, for so many of these younger people now, I mean, just even being able to get up in the morning, make it through the day is enough excitement and a gamble.
I guess we just go back to the boomers complaining about it and we have to somehow check them a little bit and be like, you kind of created this.
Well, I think too, and this will be kind of interesting because again, we're dealing with a lot of like parent-child dynamics here, but it's also you're making irrational comments, or like in this case, if you read the headline for what it is, irrational demands of other grown-ass adults.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
unless you're funding this enterprise,
right,
not much to say about it.
exactly. I mean it's like I said, when my mom was finally at the huge family, you know gathering, did anybody offer any kind of support to my husband and I to conceive? No. So then shut up.
Well,
It's
I also
not,
think that people who haven't had to go through that don't understand just how sort of
well,
cataclysmically expensive it is.
they don't. And the thing is too, really about until about when I came along, a woman in my family, if she wanted to get pregnant, all she had to do was hang her coat next to a man's coat. And she woke up pregnant the next morning. I mean, it was just that easy.
Hmm.
And then I come along, but I will say, just from my perspective, I mean, I'm glad people, I mean, if they're opting out because they choose to opt out and they're making the decision on their own, good for
Yeah.
them. And if
Yeah.
you're opting in and you're making the decision on your own, then good for you.
Yeah.
It's just the whole pressure thing. And I do have to say, in regards to the one video that I heard earlier this week when I mentioned, the young woman said she became a mother simply because she saw that motherhood was held at such a higher status in her family. That is true. And I experienced that because as soon as my cousins started having babies, there were, and there still are, and there always will be, all of a sudden, all these side conversations and this community built even within my family that I was not a part of
Hmm.
because I was not a mother.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll never be able to be a part of that. And that is because I'm not a mother.
Hmm.
And I suppose, have you encountered that? Not having children of your own? Are there some, like in your family and things, where it's like, well, you're not a dad, so yeah, you're
I don't
not
think, I
part
think
of
it's
this?
different. Like, I think it's different for guys, as so many things are. I don't
Mm.
think it's expected necessarily of us. I do have the occasional thing where, like, well, you're not a parent, so you maybe don't understand this, but it's also like not as same for us, I think, as it is for women. I think there's a very different expectation of women. Like my
Mhm.
uncles, not my uncles, my mom's cousins, I should say, who were not married or ever married. The men were never really thought of that differently, right? Like, oh, he's
Right.
just never, just never
Yeah.
settled down or whatever. But the
He's
women,
just a bachelor, lifelong bachelor. Yeah.
yeah, but the women, there's always something just a little suspicious in the language about the women because they didn't have kids and they didn't have a
Right.
husband, or they did have a husband, but they never had kids because they got married too late or whatever it was. But I think there's just a different expectation, like
Mhm.
generationally, of women our age from our own families than there are for men. So yeah, I don't know that I would have the same experience as you have had with the clickiness inside the family. And also, I'm a little awkward, so like I don't care. Right? Like if there is the clickiness in my family, I don't know that I would always pick up on it because I would just be like, I don't really want to be a part of your club. Right? Like so there's a different I think there's that different paradigm too because we didn't have that same expectation put on us as all of you
Mhm.
did. Because I remember the girls in my class, like, oh, they have to get married, they got kids. They were always talking about how many kids they were gonna have. Guys never talk about that. None of the guys in my high school ever talked about how they were going to get married and have so many kids. The girls talked about it all the time, and I think it was simply a manifestation, right, of that
Well,
that
it's that
expectation
conditioning.
setting from
Yeah.
their
It's that
family and
conditioning.
society. Yeah.
Mhm. I mean, it's just like, um, I don't know if you remember because it's been a long time since I shared the photo with you, but the photo of me when I'm about like 2 years old and I'm in my little rocking chair and I'm holding all of my dollies.
Hmm.
And your response was the conditioning started early or something.
Yeah.
What was like, yeah, here I'm at 2 years old and I'm rocking my dollies.
Hmm.
And my mom would always talk about how when my brother was born, and he's 2 years younger than I am, and like that was one of the reasons why I started with dolls because she brought my brother home and I wanted to take care of him.
Yeah.
And I guess one time he was still a newborn and he started fussing and she was getting his bottle ready in the kitchen and I carried him in. And she was like, oh no. Cause I was like, here, mama, baby. And of course, can you imagine Lord knows how I was carrying him at age 2 and a newborn with the floppy head.
Hmm. That might explain some things.
I explain a lot of stuff now, come to think of it. But so again, so if it is like, is it that nature versus nurture versus, because I remember a long time ago, because I used to get baby fever really bad. So like every time I brought home a new animal, it was, oh, Tia had baby fever.
Hmm.
Um, but I remember asking my mom one time, I'm like, were there ever times where like you were addicted to the smell of baby clothes? And she'd be like, yeah. That's your hormone. I mean, I remember like being at a store with a friend and she was pregnant. So she was getting some stuff. And I'm like, okay, here's a pink onesie. Okay, now let me smell it in blue. Yeah.
I didn't know they smelled.
And,
Maybe this is an estrogen related thing and not a testosterone
and
related thing.
it must be because my mom was like, honey, this is how the human race keeps going because we get this hormone and we women start acting this way. And that's the only reason why the human race keeps going. Because, man, that is a driver.
Hmm.
Or like when you're feeling that and you're holding somebody's baby and you smell that fresh baby smell,
Hmm.
and even the sour milk and smell and all that, it's just like now I'm just sort of like, ew. Um, like, you smell. It smelled yucky. It smelled like a diaper. But so
Because you
apparently that
are.
hormone is no longer as strong as it was. But
Probably not.
man, um, because I used to get me some baby fever.
Yeah, that's just not a thing for most guys. We do not get baby fever. Like
Yeah.
I, I, I think babies, freshly bathed heads smell pretty and funny and nice, but like that doesn't mean I want to go get one. I love handling and taking care of my cousins and my. I was the oldest out of 25 cousins, right? So I did a lot of babysitting when we were growing
Mm,
up, and I loved the babies. I enjoyed working with the kids, but I don't think I ever had a situation where it's like I got to go get me one of these. It was sort of like, well, this was fun. I'm going home now. So
yeah.
it, this is
Yeah.
this is the detriment of estrogen. We don't have to worry about it. Y'all do.
Sometimes even sometimes with estrogen, it's still like, yeah, okay, I'm done. I came in, raised hell, gave everybody some candy. We had fun. I got what I wanted out of it. Bye.
Yeah, that's the fun part.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. All right.
Well, that was fun. We talked a lot about those people. So, for those of you who are listening to us, I guess as we close out this conversation about boomers being upset about not having grandkids, if you've experienced this, share some of that in the comments with us. Let us know what your story is and anything else you want to share about this particular topic because we covered a lot
I
of ground
did.
here. This is sort of a piece with all of the other things that we have talked about randomly throughout the last almost four handfuls worth of
It's
episodes, where we were really talking about, right, like the complexity of being a Gen Zer and also like the different stressors that they face that we probably didn't face as much of. And they're now a little bit freer to say, yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that.
yeah.
And so they're doing it with work, they're doing it with college, they're doing it with relationships, and now they're doing it with having families. And I think we're hearing the beginning rumbles of frustration about it from the boomer side of it, and maybe even from some of our older Gen X
Mm,
cohort. But at the end of the day, I think it is going to have a long term social impact that I don't think anybody has fully appreciated. And we may see it in our closing days, or we may not see it at all. And it may be 30 years later. But at some point, you have to think the generation that comes after this one is going to be also, or maybe more so, conscientious about their reproduction just because of all the crazy that's going on now. So it's
mhm.
interesting to have this conversation as we see this kind of common thread that goes through all aspects of life across our generations. But for those of you who are listening, just throw in your comments. Let us know what you think. As always, be kind and be civil. Like and subscribe, share with your friends. And, check back with us next week for something else to complain about. T, it has been fun. Very kind of deep topic today.
Yeah,
Ready for a nap?
but it's okay. Yeah, I was ready for a nap before we started.
Me too.
And again, before we go, the book that I read is The Vile Thing We Created by Robert P. Oh boy, Otone, Ottone.
Oh, we stick
Does
a
that?
link to it in
We'll
the,
stick a link to it. Yeah,
the episode description, and people, if they're interested, can grab it. So,
yeah, it's a
nice.
pretty good book. Yeah,
Cool.
it is a horror novel. So, but a slow burn.
There you go.
Slow burn. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So,
Well,
but
until
in the
next
meantime,
time, everybody, I'll let T close us out. It's her turn.
it's my turn. Although I think I talked more this time because I
That's
know we have
okay.
a couple viewers who are starting to kind of track who talks the most.
Well, for the two of us, that could be a hell of a competition.
I know. I know who the saner of the two is, and it ain't me. But everyone, be good or not, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.